From the Library Executive team, we wish you welcome to the session. Dr. Kirsten Kraus, I'm not going to introduce Dr. Kirsten. You're welcome to actually go into his LinkedIn, and you'll see displayed here, as well as Academy at Wiz, and have a look and link up. There's also a chat group on WhatsApp that speaks to ChatGPT and AI use within the research and teaching and learning environments. From our side, welcome, thank you. We have had more than 60 registrations, and I see somebody from NMU here as well, and I think one from Nigeria. But I believe people also register, obviously, in order to receive the recording, and the session is being recorded. I'm not sure whether they can ask questions during your presentation, or you want to, we go with the flow. But Dr. Kraus, thank you so much for visiting us and for the session on Web of Science Research Assistant and Rightful for the institution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reinhard. It's good to be back in some way. For those of you who don't know, I've been at Rhodes for 5 years, resigned in 2017, January, something like that. So it's also good to see some of my colleagues online. Elizabeth, your name is right at the top. But it's good to see you, Elizabeth Stack. We actually work closely together also. So nice to be back. Anyway, so firstly, I work as an individual. I work independently, but I also seems to be a problem with the sound. Is it? It comes and goes. Okay. Oh, I must just stand closer. So if you're online, just let me know if you can't hear. I'm going to just kind of turn my head, but let me know if the sound is not working too well. So I work independently, but I also, I've got an advisory role with Worldwide Information Services, who represents Web of Science and Rightful for institutions. And the reason why it's sort of, twofold. It's the reason why they represent those two tools, basically, is because of my involvement as a research advisor, and basically because I believe those are some of the better ones to look at. Now, so there's a point about my sound is breaking up, Alistair. I don't know if it's battery or what it is. What would you suggest? Yeah. Hold it. Okay, is that better? Okay, let's just keep going and we'll see. So over some time, since ChatGPT came out, I've experimented with a whole range of different tools for different parts, different phases of research. And in order to sort of illustrate this, I came up with this very noisy diagram. My daughter said it's a mess. She needs to still redesign it for me. But basically what I try to illustrate there is that there are some tools that are useful for certain phases of research, and some tools are useful for other phases of research. But I must say, for those of you who don't know me, or haven't been in some of the presentations that I'm doing, is all of this actually started right in the beginning, when ChatGPT came out and I started experimenting. And my first experiment was to see if I can write a mini dissertation with ChatGPT, and I actually managed to do that in 4 days. Prompting, getting a mini dissertation, getting it examined, running it through a variety of detection tools, and it really got me interested in the process, especially where AI can be complementary and where AI would not be useful. And so and maybe before I get to the demos, what I also want to do today is not just look at product demos. And I'm not here to really demo a product. I want to put the product in context of science. And so, on the 4 phases of writing, you'll see generative writing. Now, that's different from generative AI. It's actually reflexive writing, where writing is a form of thinking. And the reality is you don't know what you think until you haven't written it down. Drafting is where your ideas start becoming an argument. It's an imagined conversation between your literature, your data, yourself, your reflections. Editing is where you start preparing the document for, presentation or for submission. And then peer review is where the community starts engaging with your arguments, your ideas, and your presentation. And, we're over some time doing many, of these workshops, and especially listening to the sorts of questions that I got from colleagues, I found that, there's quite a number of, there's actually a few major questions that pop up. And I kind of summarized this in this. And even Friday, when I was with the University of Pretoria, the participants come to me with is like the questions on the left, questions that people have. And it basically comes to these questions. It's like, which is the best tool to support lit reviews? Sam, that was your question. How does it work, and can I get it for free? Or what can I get for free? And in terms of the editing, a lot of questions that pop up relates to how to use this tool ethically for editing and proofreading. And it's firstly, there's actually two parts to this, and that is how to detect unethically AI generated content. And secondly, another one, which is actually more, is how can I avoid false positives? And the issue there is that many people, like my own daughter, one of her colleagues, when she's busy doing her honors, she worked very closely with the supervisor, and then as a final phase of the thesis, she got it proofread by some AI tool, and then it turned out to be AI generated, and the detection tool picked it up. And so that's actually a big question that pops up all the time. I want to use it ethically, but the AI detectors tell me that if I use it for proofreading, it's AI generated. But actually, part of what I want to do today, instead of just like demo two products, I also want to sort of create awareness around the other sorts of questions, leading to the other sorts of questions. And that is, if you use a tool for lit reviews, how can I avoid questionable research presented to me through these tools? And what we don't often realize is that these tools sort of train on, and it actually comes from two ways. It's large language models, which they depend on, but also the third-party training data can be polluted with all kinds of question signs. How polluted is the third-party data? How to best combine different tools for different tasks? Sam, it comes to your question. Actually, as a university, there's no one tool that you can say, this is the tool, it's got everything in it. It's actually a combination. And then at the same time, what sort of cost implications are there, and what can I get for free from these tools? How much hallucination is there in the summaries generated by these tools? Many of these tools, create summaries of literature, but because these tools depend on OpenAI or whatever, some of those summaries are incorrect, they're shallow, or there's hallucination, in the summaries. And many of us don't realize if we simply trust the summaries, we won't get to the original text. And then one thing that many of us don't realize is if you're a second language reader, many of these tools, especially in the lit review phase, the early phases, can actually help second language readers, to really master, complex, text. How should I avoid thinking and reflection to an AI tool? That's actually a critical thing, because we don't realize that if we depend on an AI tool to give us summaries of literature, and we sort of stick those summaries together, we potentially run the risk of outsourcing our thinking. And then when you're in a data collection situation, or you're busy with follow-up questions, you don't know how to respond because you've got an empty head, And then the big question is, how should I ensure systematic rigor so that the reader can corroborate or replicate the logic of scientific inquiry? Because at the end of the day, if I use an AI tool for some part of the process, like whether it's to do my topic, to assist with topic discovery, whether it's to assist with argumentation, and around argumentation, there's things we can do around data analysis. AI can complement those processes, but some of those things you can't really outsource to an AI tool. Like if there's argument flow, and I'm not talking argument flow only within a like a paragraph, but throughout the entire dissertation or the paper, that there's really a golden thread running through it. You know, if you want to apply hedging techniques to sort of indicate whether the argument is strong or not so strong, if you want to particularize methodology, or if you want to use something like Atlas TI and NVivo, which has got AI functionality now built into it with its own limitations to support data analysis, you know, what can you outsource and what can't you outsource? You know, and most of the time when it comes to argumentation, that is where you have to be in control as a human being. You have to have human oversight. But on the lit review side, there are some things that AI can really be useful. And I'm saying AI in a general sense, but some of these tools can be really useful to complement the traditional rigor that we had or still have. Okay. And then on the editing side, the big question pops up, you know, how can I use those tools safely in such a way that I can defend the possibility that if somebody comes up and say, here's a false positive, you've generated the text through AI, you know, and an AI detection tool says that, what evidence can I provide that it's not the case? And then again, a question that many people don't realize is, you know, which of the, if you just look at those examples, say Wordful, Writeful, ChatGPT, Quillbot, what large language models do they depend on to give you guidance in terms of language? Now, what many of us don't realize is that most of those detection tools, which you can see at the top there, GPT-0, Turnitin, Originality, and so forth, they kind of more or less good with the mainstream large language models. Like Originality is good with OpenAI, with Anthropic, and so forth, but Writeful. Now, this is the type of thing we need to be aware of, and this is why sort of thing I want to emphasize also is Writeful's got its own small language model. So through my experimentation, most of the time, if I get writing assistance in an ethical way, if I run it through, let's say, Originality, it doesn't pick it up as AI generated. But the moment when I start going into OpenAI, it starts picking up as AI detection. So those are the sorts of things I just want to sort of highlight today. Now, how can AI be used? I've shown you the 4 phases of writing, but practically, you know, and this is how I've used AI in different, well, let me say how I've experimented. And by the way, there's 3 things that I would suggest you do. Experiment, experiment, and experiment. And especially with a topic that you are sort of very interested in, because you will very quickly see where there's a need for fact checking. So I've used it, experimented around idea generation, topic discovery, literature searches, literature organization. And for that, I mean, you know, as a PhD student, you might read up to 1,000 articles or 300 articles. You know, you need to be able to cope with all of that. Generating references, you know, I've put it in inverted commas, but, you know, you can generate references to some degree. Summarizing, paraphrasing, reading assistance, especially if you're a second language reader. A tool like SciSpace is quite good for that. Providing guidance and structure, that is quite interesting. Because AI trains on data, and there might be a lot of training data, let's say on structure. Let's say the structure of a methodology chapter using case study research, you will get more accurate sort of guidance if you use an AI tool to give you guidance on structure. But when it comes to content and particularizing and speaking to the nuances of the context, you know, that's where AI is really sort of bad. Generating introductions and summaries, you know, one can argue that I can take my paper and can give it to a colleague and say, can you write an abstract for me for the paper? And that colleague is not necessarily a co-author. You know, one can argue for that. Tool filtering is important, and that's kind of part of what I want to do today. Give some guidance based on my experience on how one can identify whether the tool is useful or not, and how to kind of identify best ways to combine different tools. Proofreading, ethics. Ethics speaks to, you know, if you've got a copyrighted paper or you've got a transcribed interview, how do you avoid, you know, AI ingesting that? Or if you take your own new ideas and you feed it into an AI tool, how do you avoid AI training on that? And then, your ideas go into the ether and you haven't published on it yet. Those sorts of questions. Assistance with qualitative data analysis, how to explain complex statistical concepts. Assistance with peer review, I kind of don't like that. How can you outsource the peer review process completely to AI? Dealing with AI biases and then detection strategy. So there's a lot that one can do. But the question really is that if you use an AI tool for any of these sort of functions, at some point, you need to defend your ethical use of AI for whatever reason, for whether it's for topic discovery, proofreading, analysis, whatever it is, you need to be able, as a researcher, defend this. And in order to defend a claim like this, which I will read in a minute, you need to be able to provide the claim, the evidence, and your reader should be able to trace the logic to say, okay, here's some screenshots. Here's a version of ChatGPT that you used. Here are the prompts. Here's a link to the chat, the ChatGPT chat. I can agree and corroborate or replicate the process. And so at the end of the day, as students or researchers, we need to say, well, our research has been conducted in an ethical manner. That's the claim. Respondent autonomy and confidentiality is maintained and ethical data collection protocols are observed. Now, this is typical ethical clearance processes, but now with AI and plagiarism, there are additional claims to defend now, which means that our reviews of literature can't look like a typical review we had, like, let's say, 10 years ago. It now needs to build in defenses to defend the claim that no part of the work has been plagiarized or AI authored. That's a claim. What evidence do we provide? All sources have been acknowledged. All questionable references have been eliminated. There's so much going on now with AI dilution and AI pollution, and I'll show you some examples in a bit, that we cannot other than explicitly review our list of references. And so we need to build in a process to eliminate those questionable references. AI-assisted technologies have been used ethically in the production of the work. Okay. Yeah.
You find that at the stage where people apply for ethical clearance, there should be some mechanism for not vetting, but people to make a declaration whether or not how they will use AI or that they will use AI in an ethical manner.
So the question here from Sam is, at what point do you do the ethics? So there's now different levels of ethics. So, for example, the first two sentences, they talk to the normal, ethical clearance process, with regards to data collection. But when it comes to, for example, defending the claim, whether it's, the work is not plagiarized, to plagiarism tools, some people call AI plagiarism tools. It's not AI authored. All sources have been acknowledged. Those sorts of things you would build into, let's say, your review of literature or into your first chapter to say, and I'll show you some examples of policy where you actually then bring in appendices. You could do something like that where you bring in appendices to say, I've used all of these tools. These are the prompts. These are the versions, the dates, the sections, and the chapters where they've been applied. Here's some screenshots and, links to the chats. And what that would do is it will enable the examiner to say, I can see the claim. You say as an author, you claim that the research has been done ethically. What's the evidence? Screenshots, appendices, etc., etc. As a reader, I can follow your logic. I can go through your screenshots. I can go through your table. I can actually go and look at some of those chats and say, okay, I agree that you can defend this claim. Okay. And so this claim, okay, so I was at that point, so thanks, Sam. I hope it answered. But AI, just going to the second last sentence, the AI-assisted technologies have been used ethically in the production of the work, and the use of AI-assisted technologies have been declared and made transparent. So that speaks to the declaration. And so, what we need now is not just, in the past we had a Turnitin report, you had a declaration of, plagiarism, you had ethical clearance, and then maybe a language report. Now it might be useful, it is useful to say, well, there's a declaration around AI use and awareness. and also a declaration or some evidence of how you explicitly self-assessed your own list of references. To say, you know, from my list of 60 references, I've checked all of them. None of them are predatory. None of them have got signs of AI generated text in it. You know, so that sort of complicates the process. But what it, you know, in terms of preparing the document, but in terms of assessing, it simplifies the process, because if you as an examiner or a peer reviewer gets a document and an appendix or a declaration where the author actually shows how each of the references were checked, and those that are potentially questionable, retracted, or whatever have been eliminated, then you know that the author knows, and then you know that you can know, you see? So it kind of eliminates the problem of building your science on questionable research. This diagram is simply, you know, one way of looking at argumentation. But I wanted to show you this because the most important principle, if one looks at the ethical claim, if you want to offer that ethical claim as a position to agree as an outcome of the argument, it's quite slow online, I see. But if you want to offer the position that I've used AI in an ethical manner, what's the evidence that you're going to provide? And then, you know, what road can you take from the starting point, the evidence, to the claim, you know, to persuade your reader, your examiner, so that the examiner can corroborate and replicate the process. You know, that's the essence of science. So in terms of these AI tools, I see online it's quite slow in terms of response. But in terms of these AI tools, there's, you know, what it does is it actually takes the technology and it tries to put it puts a usability layer on top of it. So in the case of tools that assist with topic discovery or lit reviews, the important principle there is that you need to build onto third-party training data. Your tool is only as good as the third-party training data. And the reason for that is that there's so much AI pollution of predatory journals, pollution of retracted research in many of these tools. What many of these tools do, most of these tools do, is it builds a sort of a usability layer on top of the third-party data, and it combines it with large language models. So don't ask me to explain the technicalities of this. This is my sort of simplified way of explaining it. But you've got training data, you know, that informs the large language model, that almost like the culture behind it. And you've got third-party data providers, which is the literature that these tools depend on. And then you've got the usability layer in the form of sort of guided prompting, traceable and recorded use. Now, what we need, and I think this is a big part of today's presentation, is that, you know, we need to be aware of the limitations. And we need to know how to discern how to use these tools, when to use it and when to avoid it. And so with all these tools, there are limitations. There's weaknesses, there's biases in the training data, there's biases in the third-party data, there's hallucinations, you know, that come through the summaries, and then there's AI pollution. And together with AI pollution, we also get AI dilution, if you want. So here's just one way of sort of summarizing some of the things to illustrate how understanding third-party data will assist you in discerning whether you should use a tool or not. Now, just at the top, you know, these are not the only ones, but if we just take, for example, Atlas TI, Elicit, Connected Papers, Consensus, all of them depend on Semantic Scholar for its third-party training data. Meaning the literature all come from Semantic Scholar. It's about a 200 million size, it's growing, but a big database, all from Semantic Scholar. So, for example, if you want to buy a tool, there's no point getting Elicit and Consensus because they've got the same third-party data provider. Semantic Scholar is free, so you can just as well go to Semantic Scholar. SciSpace, you know, is quite an interesting tool, but its third-party data comes from OpenAlex, Semantic Scholar, Scholar, Google, and I suspect also they harvest a lot. The same with Trinka from OpenAlex. Litmaps come from Crossref, Semantic Scholar, and OpenAlex. The only two that I'm at this stage that I'm aware of that's got sort of secure third-party training, third-party data is Web of Science and Scopus AI. And so for us now to compare these two, now I must be honest, I haven't experimented with Scopus AI, so I cannot comment on that. But just to comment on the third-party data that both of those depend on, my experience, my observation is that Web of Science core is more secure in terms of keeping out questionable science, retracted research, predatory journals, AI-generated nonsense. Okay. Although Scopus has got a database that's about double the size. What I also like about Web of Science is that Web of Science has got its own private cloud. So the potential of hallucinations, popping into the summaries of the literature is much probably, arguably lower than Scopus AI, because Scopus AI uses OpenAI. But now I can't comment on that. I haven't experimented with it. So in terms of the training that might be useful, okay, for us, would be to look at prompt engineering. Now it's a big word actually just to say how to write prompts, to get the right stuff. But for that, for topic discovery, and like in the case of Web of Science, we need to understand prompt engineering around the third-party data getting access to the third-party data and how to negotiate the large language models. But then there's also tool filtering. We need training on how to identify the best tools. Principles of scientific knowledge production, I believe, is going to be our best defense because there's so much going on. We need training around ethics and awareness, and then policy. Okay. So in terms of, and I'm almost there with a quick demo, but in terms of detection strategies, if one now looks at, two ways of eliminating questionable science, the one is by policing it. Now, policing only works for stuff that's been identified. A lot of the questionable stuff is still sort of hidden, and fraud only works well when it's hidden, So you can police up to a point, but we know, for example, that detection strategies don't work very well, and especially if you're a second language author, it's even worse, and it's got a bias against second language authors. But values-driven assessment of science, for example, assessing the list of references is a more sustainable way of dealing, with questionable science, even if there's no explicit way of sort of reviewing the list of references. But, good quality science can keep out rubbish. So in terms of detection strategies, there's a couple of things we can do. We look at the quality of sources. We can assess the quality of sources. We can look at identifying questionable sources in the list of references. We can look at alignment between in-text and list of references. That's often an indication of whether something is AI generated. Plagiarism checking or similarity checking, and then AI detection. But amongst those three ways of detection, the most sustainable and consistent way is checking for quality references, whether it's AI-generated rubbish, AI pollution, predatory journals, retracted research. Most of the time, good research has got good referencing. Okay. These AI detectors are inconsistent. You can take the same thing and you submit it today, and tomorrow you get sort of a different result. And I can show you some examples at some point. Now, just to sort of compare, the traditional scientific rigor that we have with reviews of literature and, the AI complemented side of things. Traditionally, we have trusted and curated databases. We've got discovery tools. We've got search strategies where a user will combine keywords. There's processes for topic discovery. You've got avoidance strategies, all kinds of things. But the benefit of traditional strategy is that you can demonstrate systematic rigor, and the examiner can, or the peer reviewer can follow that same logic and come up with a similar or the same result. AI has additional benefits. Many of these tools sort of overlap in this. Now, you have the benefit of forwards and backwards referencing. And that in my discipline, for example, I found to be useful is if you find a seminal paper, you trace the paper forwards to see, who cites this paper, you trace it backwards to see who this paper cites, and you get a sort of understanding of the topic area. But AI tools really do well in terms of tracing thematic networks of papers, of themes, of authors, and those sorts of things. So if you, for example, find a seminal author, you can trace all the work of that author quite easily through most of these AI tools. And then find a sort of a collection of papers speaking to a topic, or a collection of papers that group around an author or co-authors or that sort of thing. Now, Web of Science is like alcohol-free beer, the best of both, So it's got the benefit of traditional rigor, as well as the benefits of AI, AI functionality. The difference between the two is that with traditional approaches, you use searching, while with AI, prompting. But at the back end of prompting, there's also keywords going to the database. And so when it comes to developing our prompts to search for the right stuff, we still need to understand, how to put these keywords together. But here's an interesting statement by a guy called, and I follow these guys on LinkedIn because they're sort of on top of things all the time, and there's live commentary of their experiences. This guy said, he did a couple of searches, and then he said he found dozens of new citations, which looked like AI-generated spam on Scholar Google. And so Scholar Google is just full of AI pollution, And then Jason Thatcher, which I consider one of the top guys when it comes to, giving guidance on the research methodology, all kinds of things. He said, maybe there's a need for a return to Web of Science as a gatekeeper of impact. So there's some noise in the market. People understand pollution, and they realize, tools, like Web of Science, databases like Web of Science will be our way to make sure that we don't cite bad stuff. I'm gonna skip those keywords. I actually want to get to some, a short demo. But basically, in most of these tools, what we want to do is to identify, organize, and summarize. And so that would be the thing to look at. How well does the tool help us identify literature, organize literature, and then with summarizing, obviously there are some limitations because you want to employ your own thinking as you write while you read. So reflection you can't really outsource. But these AI tools can help us identify and organize. And the interesting thing is that with identifying, often those summaries help give us, summaries of the papers so that we can better identify it. But we can't necessarily use those summaries and put it in our knowledge bases, which we then say we use to build our arguments. We can't do that. We need to engage with the literature ourselves. Okay. So Web of Science, I'm going to put this thing back because I need both hands for this. So I just want to quickly show you how Web of Science looks like. So now traditionally, Web of Science would have a smart search, not traditionally, in the past it had a smart search and advanced search. What it has now is the research assistant. And now with the research assistant, I can now sort of have a chat-based search functionality. I just want to show you some examples.
Is this a paid service?
It's paid, yeah, you pay extra for it. But it runs on Web of Science Core. And depending on what the university decides in terms of Web of Science Core, I don't know how many years back you go, but I know some universities go up to 120 years. So you've got access to all 120 years of Web of Science. But let's say, I don't know, why not if you guys know, but how many years do you go back with Web of Science Core? So let's say 50 years, it will search on what you've got available, in other words.
Does that mean that somebody at Rhodes can use it? Does the university subscribe to it? Or?
So the thing is, the university should subscribe to it. it's an extra, cost, but it's the AI layer put on top of the data that we always had with Web of Science. Right now?
Subscribe to Web of Science.
Yeah.
But not the AI portion.
Yeah.
But as an academic researcher, you can motivate for us to investigate this further, costs, how we can name, etc. So you're welcome to do that.
What kind of costs are we looking at?
It depends, because the business model is different for the institutions. Web of Science, I think, is also 50. Yeah, so it might be based on our FTEs. But we can then speak to candidates and costs.
So the purpose of what I'm going to show now, okay, so we sort of spoke about the principles, especially the principle around eliminating. Okay, the question, I see a comment. The question was, is the Web of Science research assistant an extra cost for institutions? And the response was, it's FTE based, right? And it's an extra cost as well. But it runs on whatever you have subscribed to at this point for Web of Science. So that was the response. So like most of these other tools, Web of Science has got an interface where you can type in prompts. Now, the important thing about prompts is that you have to sort of prompt in such a way that you get the right keywords. So, as I said, I always experiment with topics that I understand. So I would type something for my field. I'd say I'm interested in something around my topic. So I'm just going to type a quick prompt. So I'm using ICT for development, which is my field, and I'm adding a second type of keyword around methodology. So I'm going to say critical ethnography. And I want to add a third type of keyword speaking to the context. In this case, it's South Africa. So, with normal searching, I would just put, these types of keywords, but now I write a prompt guided by different types of keywords. So generally speaking, it would be topic related, methodology related, theory related, and context related, and then after that, you can sort of explore. But my prompt is like, I want to review literature on ICT for development using critical ethnography in South Africa. So what it then will do is it will return literature. And I actually want to quickly get my notebook there. I've made notes of things I want to show you. I'm waiting for internet. Your phone's still fine? So there we go. So what the research assistant will give you is like, my screen is already showing this stuff. It will identify, in this case, some references. Okay. I can now look at those references, and it will also give me a summary of the literature, and then it will point to, like you'll see at the end of each line, there's it points to the paper that it gets the summary from. So what I like about this is that and this is specifically Web of Science, is that if you go to how the results were generated, that link there, it actually shows you how the keywords are put together, which means that you, in a big way, can sort of monitor the strength of the combination of keywords used to access the data. And for me, it's important because those are the types of keywords that I want to tell my examiner to say, I've used Web of Science, I've combined these types of keywords, and this is what I got. And if you can explain that process, the examiner can follow the same keyword, same database, and should hopefully get the same stuff. So it gives you some, some literature. Other tools will not, allow you necessarily to assess the quality of the paper itself. But I can, for example, go to the Scandinavian Journal of Caring Sciences, and I can go and look at the journal impact factor. So in an instant, I can see that there's a summary, there's a reference, and I can immediately check if the reference is potentially, good. And in this case, we know that most of the time it's good. Actually, 99.9%. I suspect that this is a MDPI journal. No, it's not. So the point is, I can trace for each reference that I get, I can check the quality, and this is what we want, to avoid question science coming in. With each reference, there's also the thing about the option for a co-citation map, which is a brilliant way of tracing these networks of themes. So by co-citation, it basically means that if an author is cited in a paper, typically these other authors are also cited in the paper. So it kind of gives us an idea that, how authors typically cite combinations of references. So in that sense, you can trace themes, over a sort of a network of citations. I can view the data table. It shows me some details there. It also gives me some suggestions. I can, for example, look at the topic map. Topic map basically just would be, topics or themes that I can now explore further. And let's say something like the digital divide pops up as something, as an interesting theme. I can click on it, and I can also see the number of documents. And now it kind of takes you back to the typical interface that we know. And now we can sort of go and look deeper, and we can decide. One thing that I actually like is, if you're building a review of literature to look at review papers, and I can refine, and I find 170 papers that are doing reviews of literature. And I, for a fact, know that in each case, I can get an understanding of the quality of the journal. So in that sense, it's really, really useful. Just want to go back to my prompt. There's also, it makes suggestions here as to what other possible prompts that you can take to further explore, the topic. Like, for example, the key themes around ICT for development literature using critical ethnography. I can choose that prompt, and I can zone in on, whatever I find there. The nice thing about Web of Science is it's kind of already integrated and built. The research assistants, it's already integrated and built on top of a very strong, reputable database. Number one, and number two, it's highly integrated into the reference managers. So here I can see my my references. I can, let's say, view all my references. In this case, I found some of my own papers. I can go into more detail. And in this case, I get 222 results. And, I can export, to, let's say, BibTeX, to EndNote. I can download in Excel. So, you can sort of just take the references that you get and, put it into your own list of references. What I also like here is I can, trace these references, and I can go forwards and backwards. So I can see in this case, there's been 10 papers citing this paper, but I also know that all 10 of those are within Web of Science core collection. It's not like Scholar Google that half of the references that I get there that cites my paper are potentially predatory or questionable. And in this case, I can sort of follow the trends of how these papers have been cited over time. So that's the research assistant. There's also a function which is called LitReview 2.0. And so LitReview 2.0 is something, you know, I can also like type a prompt. In this case, I can use the same idea. And what it does is it starts asking you questions to help you refine your searches. So for example, it says that to ensure a comprehensive review, let's refine your request. Okay. Would you like to focus on specific aspects within ICT4D, like education? You know, it gives you some questions and you can decide, okay, for me, it's I'm interested in rural education. It kind of helps you to refine your review of literature. Although I wouldn't call it a review of literature, I would really call it a discovery phase. It gives you some suggestions there, rural education, ICT4D, and I can say, yes, I agree. I agree with that search strategy, you see, talks to me. Now, one thing that I like here is it says it's going to go 10 years back. None of the other tools I found that sort of rigid way of, you know, talking to you as to how far does it go back. It just gives you sort of access to anything it gets. I can now say, well, I don't want 10 years, I want like 25 years. So it will now search back 25 years. It gives me, you know, LitReview format. Now we know this is not a LitReview format. This is the identification phase. You know, we try to identify literature. I don't agree with this because in critical ethnography, it's not about hypotheses. It's actually about research questions. So I can change that. Gives me a sort of a better framework. And then I say, yes, proceed. And then it will start, you know, giving me papers. Again, it's asking me, you know, should I proceed? Please proceed. I shouldn't say please. I'm wasting water. Okay, now this is really just first level. Okay, I'm trying to identify the right papers. It kind of gives me ideas around research questions. Personally, I prefer to come up with these research questions myself and then compare it with what the tool gives me, as opposed to just letting the tool give me the questions. You know, I don't want to outsource my thinking in this sense. Okay, so now I might, let's say I'm happy with these documents. I want to, let's say, look at this one, Castles. I want to view the full record, and then I go further and I start investigating, you know, different things about the paper. So are there any questions at this point? Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question. So, sure. So you're showing us how the tool works. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Right. So you're showing us how the tool works,
yeah,
but the university doesn't have access to the tool.
Yeah.
That's a major practical problem, isn't it?
It's a financial problem. I guess that's
and then I understood we could motivate.
Yeah.
But how do we motivate if we don't have access to it? So in other words, here's a tool. I can't access it, so I don't know how it will help me. But I'm going to motivate for it anyway. How do I go ahead?
I guess there's a process, a financial process, which I maybe Wynand would be more better to answer that.
Thank you. I think it adds to my point to one of the previous questions as well, in the chat. What we can do, I think we can request trial access. And from there, we can communicate with you and say, look, we have access to this for a period of time, play with it, and then that can build your motivation as well through your faculty librarian. And yes, in the end of the day, it is a financial consideration, but we are not limited in terms of, I mean, what you want is to provide the best tools to the researchers. If this is something you want, we can consider it. Just to say as well that this is Web of Science core, meaning it's got the four, if I remember, the 4 databases that it speaks to, but also our new generation library management system, which will be launched in January next year, has also the same capabilities built in, possibly not to this extent, but also looking then at a broader data set, meaning those things that we subscribe to. So it's worthwhile to test the water, learn more, and then also see what we're going to come up with in the next 12 months. If that, I hope that answers the question.
So,
thank you. When will the trial period start?
yeah.
Whether they should possibly negotiate a different deal and start to include AI into the SANLIC deal for Web of Science. I'm not sure whether they'll do that or not, but one could always ask.
Yeah. So just for the online participants, the question was around getting access to a trial. There was a trial last year for both Web of Science and Scopus, but there wasn't many requests, right? But we can reactivate the request, or you guys, obviously.
I wasn't aware of it.
Yeah. But the thing is, I think part of the part of the way to persuade could be to use some of the stuff that I spoke about. For example, and I would consider this, in my view, the most important thing is that Web of Science does not only use accessible data, it uses the data that you need. And there's a difference to give you literature that is available as opposed to literature that you need. And so Web of Science really plays in both these areas. And it allows you to eliminate questionable science from your reviews of literature.
Thank you for that response. But moving from his premise is that one, you can't go not have AI in one way or the other in 2025.
Yeah.
You're really gonna be falling very behind.
Yeah.
Interesting enough, we introduced at the business school this year a module, value creation with AI, which I'll be giving later the year, because we felt that it doesn't make sense not to have that. And the number two, I think at the end of the day, it's really a matter of what would make financial sense. I don't know whether it's a once-off package that needs 1,000, whatever the things, or you might even have packages whereby you're saying there would be 10 licenses, 20 licenses, whatever the case might be, in order to move forward and to avoid a situation that you are sitting with. Because whether we like it or not, if there's going to be an AI generated with other nonsense and all of that in a paper that I write as an academic, the interesting part is that they're not going to just say Andile. They're going to say, because it won't have an impact on who Andile is. It will be the Rhodes University academic, because it have a better impact if now it's talking to the university. So as much as there's gonna be motivation in all of that, I honestly think that there is some proactivity that really should be coming from Powers B, including the library, on how can these tools of the research.
I think it's a financial argument, but it's also a scientific argument. You know, how can we keep science clear? I mean, if we just, I don't know, Wayne, do you want to first say something?
Well, yes, I think that's one of the points I wanted to make is that we have been, from the library, been proactive. We work close with Churchill as well on AI tools. We're expanding the scope. So the Academics Roundtable, for instance, is one of those committees on campus that's very important to investigating changing technologies. But what I've learned today, what is of real value, is that although there's a lot of free tools, and that's what I think a lot of people play with. Myself, I play with the free tools, but I did not realize the extent to which I was aware of it, but I didn't fully realize the extent to which Web of Science would actually eliminate bad science. And I think that's the core thing we have to ask. It's not about the availability of a tool, many tools available, but we'll have to pay for quality. And that we haven't heard before. So that's something we have to investigate in. And we would love to meet with you. Samuel sitting in front of you, I think you know him. We can have these discussions and we can take the motivation forward. If the university stands, if the academics stand together and fully motivate for the need in terms of research and teaching and learning, then it's not a request you can normally deny. Then it's a case of we have to see how we can accommodate this. That's tomorrow afternoon.
So you're going to be our agent then?
Yes. Yeah. Simon and I won't be there tomorrow, but Nele Mabona will be on the roundtable. Thank you.
If I can maybe for a moment speak to AI pollution, just to sort of emphasize the extent of the problem. You know, this came out a while back, AI dilution, AI pollution, where AI now trains on its own output. But if you start looking at science, it's got a massive implication on science. Like, here's just an example from Neurosurgical Review, where they've been inundated with AI-generated manuscripts. In this case, this guy is, you know, his work led to 1,000 retractions when he was using a tortured Fraser detector to identify, you know, problematic papers. This speaks to the fact that, and this speaks to how urgent the need for us is to protect the integrity of science, and especially in terms of pollution. AI trains on retracted research, it trains on predatory journals, it trains on anything that it gets, and it cannot distinguish between true science and retracted science or questionable science. So in this case, ChatGPT trains on retracted research and gives bad medical advice. This one talks to the unbelievable scale of AI pirated books. This one, I mean, this is hair-raising where the guy just admits, he says, we pulled off a SEO heist, exported the competitor sitemap, turned their list of URLs into article titles, created 1,800 articles. 18 months later, we've stolen 3.6 million total traffic, 500K monthly traffic. So you have AI pollution, synthetic trash, heaps floating in the online ocean. There's a website called Academic AI that tries to collate these. And I just took one case study as an interest, just to sort of explore. What I did is I took that paper to sort of trace the impact of citation pollution over 2 or 3 generations, you know. PLOS One is a reputable journal. I looked at the reason why this paper was retracted. And the big thing there was that it had a lot of messy references, basically. You know, 18 of the 76 references were unverifiable. and then 6 additional references. But this was a retracted paper from a reputable journal, Scopus Web of Sciences, DOAJ. I went to Scholar Google and I wanted to see how this was cited. And I found 8 citations. That was around March, April. 2 of those citations were actually analyses looking at AI-generated research, but then the other 6 was research citing this retracted paper. The first one was educational studies citing the retracted paper, but the funny thing is it was published in June while the retraction was in April. So their review processes didn't build in the sort of elimination of possible questionable science, just speaking to the problem. Number 2, there was a preprint. So preprints we know is not yet peer reviewed. Number 3, 4, and 5 were journals that were listed nowhere. But then number 6 was interesting. International Journal of Computing and Digital Systems. That journal cited the retracted journal. You see the International Journal of Computing and Digital Systems. That journal cited the retracted paper, but it was listed in DOAJ and Scopus. SoftwareX cited the International Journal of Computing and Digital Systems. So it's like the grandchild. SoftwareX is really a good journal, but the International Journal seems to be a questionable journal. If I just look at how the website looks like, and so here, in my experimentation, this sort of nosiness, I found a potentially predatory journal on the DEAD list. And that was DOAJ and Scopus. SoftwareX cited this bad journal, which cited the retracted journal, but SoftwareX is quite a good journal. But because of bad citation behavior, for a lack of a better word, like at the bottom right, you can see that, that claim is only supported with a single reference. And ideally, you want multiple references. So if there's a bad reference, you can take it away and the others would still support the claim. But it just shows one example of how one AI-generated paper polluted, a bunch of things. This is education studies, impact factor of 1.8. But this one cited a retracted paper long after, it was retracted. So it leaves us with this question. Where are we going with this? We're generating AI, text. We get AI to review it. AI trains on the stuff, and where's the human in the process? And Robert Davison had a post saying that basically, you just kind of sit on the side and you facilitate the process. AI gets everything, generates the text, reviews it, publishes it, trains on it. Any questions before I move on? Yeah.
Kirsten, you kept on speaking about integrity in the science, and what I'm concerned about is a lot of us here today and online are researchers, but I think there's additional onus on the reviewers and the editors of journals. And we had a question last week from one of our own journals asking, what do I do when I receive a paper? What should I look out for, and what kind of statement should be included in both the submission of an article for review, also on the website itself, and then also how does this link up with, from my side, COPE and etc. Because I think that's more, it's a reviewer, an author, a reviewer delves deep into the article, but an editor will be the brunt of something like this. It's a challenge.
I would easy answer would be good luck, but the more complex answer, there's a couple of things I think you could put in. We know AI detectors don't work. But one way, and as I showed earlier, the most consistent way of identifying whether science is bad, whether it's AI generated or predatory or whatever, is normally to look at the references. So like I said this morning, you could submit your Turnitin report for a journal. Now, normally you want to make sure it's not plagiarized. And we don't have as much problems there now because it's all AI sort of massaged. But what you can ask from the author is to create some sort of report like this, where they indicate that for each of the references, you know, whether it's a conference, a book, or a journal, what's the impact factor, if there's a rating, whether it's on, you know, whatever list, whether it's on the removed list, D8, Web of Science, and so forth. And in the process of producing such a report, the author will automatically eliminate the stuff even before submission, because people don't know, you know, they kind of get caught up sort of unknowingly in this. Well, most honest people, that's my assumption. The dishonest ones will always be dishonest, like, you know. But submitting something like this could help us a lot in eliminating the problem early on. Like I just showed you this example from an AI-generated paper. If that submission would have gone through the references and looked at whether they were not potentially retracted, they would have picked it up, they would have eliminated the references, that one reference in that case, and then, you know, would have had a much better paper.
But maybe my question then arises, how good are the databases of the retracted papers?
The databases of these lists,
None of the retracted papers.
they're trying to keep up, but I don't think they
Because I think the biggest challenge, the reason I'm asking you the question might be how effective do they keep up with those retracted papers? I mean, you mentioned a paper retracted in April,
Yeah.
and a paper published in June. Chances are 9 out of 10, knowing that, I mean, there are few journals that will process your paper from start to end in three months or 4 months. Majority of them, they actually would take 6, 8, even 9 months, sometimes even longer. Some actually, when you submit that paper, by the time they review and all of that, they're gonna say, add new references on literature or whatever, updated reference because of the time spent.
Yeah, how to keep up to date? I mean, there's a most of the time we're on the back foot. We're trying to keep up. And it's a whole different workshop, you know, just to talk to that specific question. And I'm a bit, you know, I actually want to get to rightful, but just as an example, you know, there's, you know, reviewing references can and should be a process. It's not just, is it on the D8 list? Here's just some examples of how you could assess the quality of references. But, you know, it's not just checking whether it's on the D8 list. You need to check, for example, if you're in my discipline, which is information systems, or in management, you want to check on the ABDC list, how that paper rates on the ABDC list, and then see if you can find something on the library website. So if it's not on the library website, most probably, you know, it could be questionable. You know, does that paper have the journal have an impact factor, and what is a good impact factor for the discipline? You can go to websites like predatojournals.org and see if the publisher or the journal is in fact there. So you kind of build multiple layers of checking. So, you know, if you get to the point, you know, of DIJ removed and everything still checks out, then it's kind of okay. But then you can even go further and say, well, let's go and look at the author and how many times the paper has been cited on Scholar, Google, or Web of Science, because the citations will also give an indication of whether the paper is good. Why not?
Sorry, I just want to add to that. The one thing that's mentioned there is the DIJ removed, but there's also sometimes legitimate reasons why something is removed. It doesn't necessarily always indicate bad science. Like Director of Open Journals would remove items if it's not journals, if it's not open access anymore. So just be careful how you assess it. There's always a reason given. But I think the point is, and through research that Chris and I did, is that science needs to regulate itself much better. So proactiveness from the researchers in spotting challenges, not just around Retraction Watch. Remember, Retraction Watch is a body of Crossref that only facilitates. It's the academics, the research, etc., that notifies Retraction Watch and will then say, look, you know, flag this because we think there's a problem. So it's actually a global responsibility to maintain integrity in science. There's a number of questions,
Right,
Kirsten, on the chat.
So I'm going to take it from bottom to top. Willem, I don't know if Willem, you want to talk, or I see there's a question.
Yeah, I can quickly talk if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. We can hear you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just quick, I mean, my questions there are kind of leading a little bit. But before I get to those, I just want to say, I guess probably want to, instead of using all these heuristics about tracing impact factors of journals and stuff, which I think is really good way of determining the legitimacy of citations. I think the good old just trick of reading an article from beginning to end is probably also quite a good way of determining its legitimacy. And I think we're not reading enough. But let me get to the questions in the chat, which have to do with the types of models at the base, sort of powering or running Web of Science's core, the chat function, and that research assistant. Because part of my question here is, so I presume it's using some kind of retrieval augmented generative kind of model, right? A RAG model to pull or pass sources into the chat that you now see, and that's where it's making those nice little links for the sources and so on. But my question is, we're putting a lot of onus on researchers here to act ethically, but to what extent are the AI companies acting ethically in presenting openness and transparency around the data sets that they are using, not to feed into Web of Science, because we know those are Web of Science's own sources, but the training data sets used to train the RAG model in the first instance aren't being published anymore, right? Nor are the architectures of these AI engines driving these chats and stuff like that being published. And so I feel that there's a huge focus at the moment on researchers acting ethically, but nobody, I think, or not enough people are asking the question of, are companies like OpenAI, for instance, publishing the data sets and their code for these models to allow transparency around the type of stuff that's being used to train the models that we end up using the front end of, if that question makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And actually, you reminded me of, some statements and articles I saw a while back that you get predatory AI tools. AI tools just jumping on the bandwagon, claiming that they support the research game, supporting researchers. But actually, in the back end, they operate unethically. There's a lot of noise when DeepSeek, DeepSeek, the Chinese model came out. They said, well, where did they get the training data? They stole it from OpenAI. There's some articles on that, but then where did OpenAI get it? They stole it from us. And then we as researchers, we write our stuff, and then you get articles saying, big publishers selling original researcher-produced articles to OpenAI so that their models can train better. So it's a big question. I don't think I have the answer. I don't know if we... Yeah, well, RAG model. What's a RAG model, Willem?
If I don't remember if I get the acronym correctly, but basically retrieval augmented generative model. So it's a ChatGPT, for instance, is just an LLM. So it's taking a statistical distribution of words, tokens that add up to a nice little sentence that looks correct, but is drawn from a series of untraceable kind of sources of connections. RAG model is basically something that says, I'm taking a bit of information from a very specific, the LLM is drawing information from a traceable source. So it's saying, if I'm getting, I quote this sentence, the LLM quotes this sentence, and then it can say where it got that sentence from without hallucinating. That's basically what a RAG model is. Anything that's not using RAG at the moment, or things beyond RAG, is basically just making statistical predictions about what sounds correct, basically. That's the short summary of it.
Yeah, so a RAG model is sort of counter science, it seems. Because science, you want systematic rigor, while a RAG says it's all hidden and missing.
No, you definitely want a RAG model, because that's the thing that's allowing you to draw a citation into that chat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
But okay,
you don't have that
this-
just, yeah.
Thanks for that, Willem. I'm actually conscious of my time, but there's one more question, then we move to Rightful.
As
Yes,
you
sir.
are talking, and I got some questions in my mind. Because if you are saying there are so many articles that are retracted due to all these issues, AI usage and sources not found and all that, and they are retracted in numbers. If we encourage our students to download articles when they get them from our website, so that they can work offline later, there are no guarantees that these students are going to go back and check if these articles are still sitting on those journals, and they will just submit their thesis. So it means now we need to have another layer of quality assurance
For
or check
sure.
at the research office to check all these things.
Yeah.
But now it means the students are going to rewrite because they use wrong articles if that is found out.
Yeah. That's exactly my point. Yeah. Sure, yeah. Last response. I want to move on to Rightful, conscious of time.
Apologies, excuse me, we also subscribe to LibKey. And LibKey integrates with Retraction Watch. There's currently 59,000 journal articles on Retraction Watch alone. So that's why one of the reasons as part of information literacy that they have to be taught to use certain third-party tools like ThirdKey to ascertain the quality and the questionability of that science.
Did you say LibKey or ThirdKey?
Third Iron LibKey.
Oh, Third Iron
Third
LibKey.
Iron LibKey.
Yeah.
Third Iron LibKey. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all the questions. This is a full day conversation, I'm sure. I want to go to Rightful. I'll try and keep it, in that in about an half an hour. But just if we just take the sort of illustration that I used to show how Rightful functions. Rightful uses its own small language model. It uses Anthropic and it uses OpenAI for different things. Now, before I go into a demo, the small language model is trained by Rightful's team, and it's based on published papers in linguistic research. So the type of responses that you get with the title generator and the abstract generator are very accurate. And the experiments that I've been doing is it's not detectable by AI. And like I said, often the big question is not, how do I detect AI, generated stuff? It's more a question of, I don't want to be falsely accused, for the large, for Rightful to, where it uses OpenAI and Anthropic is when it comes to paraphrasing and summarizing and condensing and splitting sentences and those sorts of things. So it's kind of quite an interesting combination of language models that it uses for different functions. So I'm going to go straight into a demo of Rightful. So the example that I want to use is, my own daughter's thesis. Now, for Rightful, at this stage, there's a opportunity for a university to actually test some of the AI functionality. So if you're interested, you can get in contact with Wiz. But for Rightful, if the university subscribes, you can go and add the plugin, and then it's built into Microsoft Word. And I just want to sort of briefly show all the functions. Now, what it can do is I can select, for example, a paragraph, and I can say check the paragraph. And then it will give me some suggestions as to what whether I should accept this or not. Okay. And so if I am now, this is an interesting one. you know, my daughter is Afrikaans speaking, and so she has the same problem as me, is that we have this tendency of everything is singular. We don't have, you know, everything is you is, I is, you, everyone's is, you know, that's in our language. And so she made the mistake where she says time and politics has affected the visual culture. And so in this case, you know, just highlighting the paragraph, it shows the suggestions. But what I like about Writeful, because it's built in, I can, through track changes, build evidence that I've used Writeful ethically for proofreading. So in this case, I can say, okay, I agree with have, I accept it, and then it implements, like, you know, the change through track changes. And as a defense, you can always submit the document with track changes still active as a separate document or as an appendix to prove that you used AI ethically. Another example is if I, you know, just to show the title, in this case, you know, if I want to check the title, there's a mistake there. It says it's with a apostrophe S, and it shouldn't be. It should be it's without apostrophe. So it picked up that problem, but now instead of saying traveler wagon, it changed it to traveling wagon. So in this case, it made a slight mistake, but that's fine. I can decide I want to accept only the one change and I want to reject the other one. You see? So literally you can like go and check the entire document and it will give you all the suggestions, and then you can accept or reject. I just want to show you the thing about Writeful is that it's very sort of context aware. And they claim that they've trained on academic literature. Now, just something about this thesis, it talks to the gypsies, you know, we call them gypsies, but in Ireland, they call them travelers. Now, there's a lot of research about travelers. Just to show you one example of where something came out incorrect, there's the word jail. And if I go and check jail, and ask it to fix, you know, that paragraph, it will give me the word GAOL. I don't know, it's a bit small there. But GAOL is a more archaic way of writing jail in English in Ireland. And so, although that's a mistake, it actually confirms the fact that Writeful is very context sensitive. So it really trains on academic literature to suggest the changes. Now, the interesting thing about Writeful, and I just want to also illustrate this, is, and I want to take another document as an example. It has a title generator and it has an abstract generator. So I can say, well, I need you to generate an abstract. Now, okay, now there's a principle here as well. Personally, I believe you first write the abstract based on certain principles. You know, you need to have something around the topic and the discipline, something about the problem or issue, the approach, and the value to the reader and community. So the best is to write it yourself and then see what something like Writeful or ChatGPT produces for you. So in this case, it generates an abstract. If I'm not happy with the abstract, I can say, well, I'm going to ignore it. Or I can say, well, I like this abstract. I can stick it in there. And there it is. I can then review and check. Okay. Now, at some other point, I already, you know, generated a few abstracts, and I just wanted to show you, also through Writeful. In this case, this was my original abstract, the top one, and this was the first attempt. And just notice the last sentence, how close it is to my original writing. Compelling issues for further research, compelling issues for further research. Writeful was quite close, picking up my writing style, generating the abstract. I found that, you know, even testing deep research, it generates an abstract, and I was trying to prompt it so that when it generates an abstract, that it's in line with my style of writing using the same concept. And after several prompts, about 10 or so prompts, I still found that it's easier to simply write it myself, you know, as opposed to use deep research. But, you know, Writeful has this functionality. But I just want to illustrate, you know, the issue around the question of how detectable is this? And this could be an interesting exercise for any sort of thing. If I take my own abstract that I wrote, and the reason for showing this is not to show you how to bypass the system, it's actually to show how one can avoid false positives. You know, I'm speaking to honest people. That's my assumption, my starting assumption. So just to take originality as an example, they say they work well on GPT 4.0, etc., etc. If I take my personally written abstract and I pop it in there, it says it's 100% confident that it's human written text. If I take the AI generated one now, that's through Writeful, and I stick it in there. Let's see what it does. It again says it's 100% human written. So it's in a way, it's a tool that is safe if you don't want to get false positives. Okay. The tool doesn't allow you to generate anything, you know, much more than that. You could ask it some questions, you know, and generate some text, but it's not like it will generate pieces of text for you. So in that sense, it's sort of contained as well. It also has functions. It also has functions where you could go there, and on my case, because I'm an Afrikaans first language speaker, I tend to have the problem of writing very long sentences. And so I could, let's say, I just want to find one example. Here's, let's say, a research question. Okay, that's a very long research question. I want to split it up. So there's a couple of options there. I can split the sentence. And that is, you know, in my case, I tend to write very long sentences. I can split it up. If I'm not happy with this version, I can, you know, create another one, regenerate. If I'm happy, I can replace it. What I did find, though, is, let's say I'm inserting it there now. Now, this is AI generated, this version, and I go to originality just to show you that this actually runs on OpenAI. It's probably going to say it's AI generated. Sometimes it doesn't, but it's kind of inconsistent. So let's just see. Okay, I need to add more words. Let me just say hello there, just for this exercise. Okay. Let me just select more text. It doesn't want to pick it up right now. So let's just try this one. This is another one. This is Trinka. Minimum of 100 words. Okay, that was my intention. I can't get to show you the demo, but okay, so that's just to show that if you want to split a long sentence into smaller sentences. There's also some other options. So let's say you want to, you know, convert your article into a short LinkedIn article. You can also, you know, write something more punchy. Okay, so it's got more like glamorous writing, you know. I call it Christmas tree writing. It gives you some suggestions. Happy Valley stands proudly as the administrative and bustling business heart of a quaint rural district nestled within the picturesque KZN Midlands. Now you can do the same with ChatGPT. You can, you know, take the same piece of text and make it more scientific. So there's that. Or what sometimes happens with me is I write too drawn out. So one case, I had a paper which was like 11 pages long, and the limit for the conference was 10 pages. And you know what I had to do is actually go and shorten some things. Now, it took me ages to shorten things because what do I remove? But Writeful can make things more concise. Obviously, one needs to go and check, you know, whether, you know, it still says what you wanted to say. But there's some options that you can go and check. Now, this is 160 words. Now it's 105 words. I still now need to go and see whether the, you know, whether the text in fact says what it's supposed to say. Now, ideally, you know, when you do these sorts of things, you want to keep track changes on so that you can sort of follow the changes over time. The other option is, you know, if you've got long sentences, let's say short sentences, you want to make it longer. Let's just take 2 sentences and see what happens if we merge this. In contrast with, and let's add this sentence. And let's make it one single sentence, it's joint sentences. Okay. So it's quite flexible in that sense. What Writeful can also do is it's got a citation check. So if you have a piece of text, academic text, and there might be certain statements which doesn't have a proper citation, you can upload a manuscript. And just to show you here, you know, I can upload my manuscript, takes a few seconds, and then it tells you where there's possible places where you missed the citation. So in this case, it seems to be happy, okay, but maybe, you know, because it's a fairly good research paper, but you could take a piece of text and sometimes, you know, you don't have a citation, and then Writeful will tell you. The other option is I can upload a full document, like in this case, you know, I can also choose the same document and I can say, well, can you do the language checking? And so it will take quite a few minutes. You know, we won't do it right now, but it gives you a language edited with track changes document, and then you can, okay, there we go, see. It makes suggestions as to, you know, what, you know, you could possibly change. There I said a number of, and they suggest changing it to several. So it runs through the changes and you can download it, and then you can slowly work through your track changes. If there's anything else, I just want to. And then the thing about summarize and explain, sometimes, you know, there might be a piece of text that you don't understand completely, and Writeful can also assist with explaining that. As I said, you can generate a title. Although I didn't like the titles, you know, I first wanted to, you know, I first had to write my own title and then compare with the title that Writeful generated. I found that deep research was actually a bit better, you know, when you upload a document and you ask it to generate a title. Personally, I find it, you know, I prefer to write my own abstracts and then get whatever tool I use, like deep research or whatever, to compare the abstracts generated by the tool with mine. I prefer to write my own titles and then compare it. So it's quite a versatile tool. And I just want to conclude with the following. You know, it's always, again, a question of cost. This is just individual subscriptions. Now you can see the first one says that Writeful specializes in academic writing, Grammarly, general professional writing, PaperPal, academic writing, and Trinka, academic writing. Writeful is really good with academic writing, but the big thing about Writeful is that it is way cheaper than Grammarly. And Sandly's got a deal in South Africa that gives Writeful at a much cheaper price. It can also assist with non-English feedback, okay, which I haven't tested. It can help you during and after writing. It's got the most features. You can toggle between US versus American style of writing. It's got a paraphraser. It can make languages more scientific. It can join or split. It can summarize and explain. It can generate titles and abstract. Well, most of the other tools don't have all of those functionalities. I don't know if there's anyone in the STEM sciences, but and maybe I can try and illustrate that is in Overleaf. I just want to show you how powerful this is in Overleaf. So in Overleaf, you have all the functionality that you have in Word, plus you can, for example, upload a handwritten equation. And I can show you quickly. Find my example. So here's my handwritten equation. I simply drop it into Overleaf, and I say generate, and it generates the code. Now you can see I've already done it twice there. It generates the code for that. I insert, and I then recompile. And the same with, you can have like a handwritten table. You take a picture of it, you just drop it in, and it generates the code for the table. And it's even, you see, there's the third version of the third equation there. And so the thing about Overleaf and LaTeX is it's a sister company of Writeful. So they're really, really well integrated. And I think, Wynand, with that, if there's any questions on Writeful, I'll take those, maybe online as well, but I think I'll conclude with that. Questions?
I've got two.
Sure.
The first one is about the usability of Writeful. It seems like possibly students can use that to sort of like mask the fact that they have AI generated content produced by tools such as Gemini or ChatGPT. So it seems that might be leading them into the direction of a tool that can help you get away with plagiarism.
The only counter argument, well, the counter argument to that is that Writeful only helps you generate abstracts and titles. The rest of the time, it just fixes your text. Cheers. So it's not like ChatGPT where you can like generate big pieces of text and try and humanize it and then bypass the system. Writeful, you're really more in control of things. It's only with the abstract and the title.
And then the second question has to do with the Web of Science tool that you showcased earlier on. I wanted to look at the reproducibility aspect. So it's very important for researchers to be able to reproduce research afterwards. Now, these prompts, you mentioned that, for instance, someone could list their prompts of how photographs of them. Can they actually be reproduced? I know in tools like ChatGPT or Gemini, you can't really have the same prompt and expect to see the same exact result. Does that work the same way for the Web of Science tool?
With Web of Science, my experience is you can put the same prompt and then it kind of produces different keywords at the back end. I can, however, go and take the original keywords and reproduce that, and I will get the same results. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. In the sense that it's not 100% this exact same thing. Like if someone was actually trying to go back and redo the research or just check up on the integrity of the scientific research itself. So
if let's just want to see if I can get this going. Slow. So if I go to my original prompt, okay, let me just go there. I've seen that if I take exactly that same prompt, that it kind of gives me different results each time. But this link there, how the results were generated, gives me, the specific keywords that was used to access the database. So what you can do as an author is to record those keywords. And that's the one difference about this tool compared to all the other tools is you don't know what happens in the background in terms of the searching, but with Web of Science, you actually have this rigor of recording the keywords. And, on that point, I actually wanted to show you this as well. There's an example here in this policy from an Australian university where they show how one can, build a sort of appendix with evidence that you've used AI tools ethically, and also declare. So there you've got the tool, whatever the tool is, whatever tool you use, why you use it, the prompts that you used, the section where you used it, the date that you use it, and you can even now add the version of ChatGPT, for example, and then add a column to actually copy the chat from ChatGPT to show, so an examiner can go to the chat and exactly follow your prompts. Now, most examiners will know if they use the same prompt, they won't get the same result, but at least they can see there's rigor in the process. So these sorts of things can be, used to defend, the fact that you've used AI ethically. Yeah. I see there's a couple of questions online. Can you please show the first comparison slide with Rightful and Grammarly? Okay. Yes, I will share my presentation. Lungile, I don't know if it's that one. I will definitely share all the slides. Why not? Yes, and then how would Rightful handle subject-specific terminology in underrepresented disciplines? That's something to be tested. It says that it's good with language, different languages, but I haven't tested it, so it's definitely something to test. Sinclair? Willem, thanks for that link. Any other questions? No questions?
Just to respond to what you say on. But want to go home, I see that. Or want to go and have coffee. Just responding to Lungile's other question, which you missed, is are the retracted articles listed on LibKey? No, they're not. Retracted articles is listed on the Retraction Watch website under Crossref, but LibKey integrates with it. So the library supplies LibKey as a service, and you can click on a journal through the LibKey link that's provided, and then it will tell you immediately whether something's retracted, and it's immediate retracted. It's not old data. Kirsten, from our side, thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative, and I think you have to come back at one stage and spend a couple of days. I see a lot of challenges ahead, but I also see a lot of opportunities. But I think what you said most important is that we have to experiment, and we have to play, and we have to master these tools. But I can just imagine it's quite a nightmare for not just, especially not just for students, but also for the researchers and lecturers, etc. So thank you very much. Thank you. All right.